In 1338, in a small cemetery beside Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, someone carved tombstones in Syriac script. The community was Nestorian Christian, a trading settlement along the Silk Road, and in that year and the next, an unusual number of its members died. The tombstones record a pestilence. No name for it, no explanation, just death, in numbers that did not match an ordinary year. For nearly 7 centuries, those stones sat in dry mountain steppe, holding a secret that no European chronicle, no papal bull, no royal tax record could provide. In 2022, a team led by historian Philip Slavin and geneticist Johannes Krause extracted DNA from the teeth of the people buried beneath those stones, sequenced the Yersinia pestis they found, and placed it at the exact root of the phylogenetic tree from which every Black Death lineage descends. The deadliest pandemic in human history began here, not somewhere in Central Asia. Here, this lake, this community, these teeth, and almost everything you learned about what happened next is either wrong or significantly incomplete. You were probably taught the same version most Americans over 40 absorbed from textbooks and PBS specials. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried plague. 1/3 of Europe died between 1347 and 1353, and the medieval world, already filthy, superstitious, and miserable, simply collapsed under the weight of its own squalor. It is a clean story. It has the advantage of being memorable and the disadvantage of being, at nearly every point, inadequate to the evidence we now have. The evidence comes from bones, not from chronicles, though those matter. Not from the literary set pieces of Boccaccio, though those are vivid. The revolution in Black Death scholarship began in 2011, when a team led by Kirsten Boss at McMaster University did something no one had done before. They reconstructed the complete genome of Yersinia pestis from skeletons excavated at East Smithfield, London's documented plague cemetery of 1348 to 1349. A pathogen dead for more than 600 years, sealed inside the dental pulp chambers of medieval Londoners, gave up its full genetic identity under modern sequencing. That single breakthrough opened a decade of discovery that has not slowed. But the bones told scientists something else, too. Something the chronicles never recorded. Something that changes the entire story of who the Black Death killed and why. The teeth of the victims were already damaged before the plague arrived. Bioarchaeologist Sharon DeWitte, working at the University of South Carolina, examined skeletal remains from London cemeteries spanning the decades before and during the plague. She found something that would not have been visible to any medieval observer. The people who died in 1348 and 1349 showed significantly elevated rates of enamel hypoplasia, horizontal grooves and pits in the tooth enamel caused by severe nutritional stress during childhood. They showed cribra orbitalia, pitting in the eye sockets linked to chronic anemia. They showed periosteal lesions, markers of inflammation and infection on the long bones. These were not the marks of plague. These were the marks of famine, carved into the bodies of children who had survived the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 and carried its damage into adulthood. The Great Famine. You may never have heard of it, and that itself tells you something about what history remembers and what it discards. Between 1315 and 1322, torrential rains and bitter cold, the opening salvos of what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, destroyed harvests across northern Europe for years in succession. Historian William Chester Jordan documented the scope: crop failures cascading from one season to the next, livestock epidemics killing cattle and sheep, grain prices tripling and quadrupling, the poor eating bark and roots, cases of cannibalism recorded in chronicles from Ireland to Poland. An estimated 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population died. The survivors, the children who lived through it, grew up malnourished, immunologically compromised, and physiologically scarred. Those scars are legible in their skeletons 600 years later. And those were the people the plague found when it arrived in 1348. This is the connection that recent science has made visible. The plague did not strike a healthy continent. It struck a continent that had been starving, intermittently, for 30 years. Bruce Campbell's landmark study, The Great Transition, reconstructs the climate data and shows that the 1340s brought another return of cold, wet conditions after a partial recovery in the 1330s. Harvests were poor across much of Europe in 1346. The population that greeted the Yersinia pestis bacterium was nutritionally depleted, immunologically stressed, and demographically fragile. The famine had set the table. The plague sat down to eat. If you have ever walked through a European cathedral and noticed how the stones hold the cold even in summer, you have touched the world the plague entered. Imagine instead a village. Not stone, timber and wattle and daub, thatched roofs, narrow lanes of packed earth that became mud in rain. Kitchen gardens growing cabbages and leeks, not potatoes or tomatoes, which would not arrive from the New World for another century and a half. Chickens scratching in yards, a pig or two. A stone church at the center, the only permanent building most of these people would ever enter. The smell of wood smoke and animal dung and wet wool. An ordinary place, a living community. Now empty it. English manorial records, among the most detailed administrative documents surviving from the pre-modern world, allow historians to do something extraordinary. Count the dead village by village, tenant by tenant. Philip Slavin's analysis of hundreds of these records shows that some English villages lost 80% or more of their tenants between 1348 and 1350. 80%. Picture a village of 100 souls, and then picture it with 20. Doors standing open, fields unharvested, livestock wandering untended. The archaeological evidence of deserted medieval villages across the English countryside shows house platforms overgrown, wells abandoned, field boundaries slowly erased by grass and time. These places did not recover. Many were never resettled. But here is the detail that has haunted researchers and that no one can fully explain. Next to a village that lost nearly everyone, a neighboring village, same lord, same soil, same climate, sometimes less than a mile away, might lose fewer than 30%. The plague did not move like a wave. It moved like a fire in a rainstorm, consuming one house and leaping over the next. Slavin's maps of English manorial mortality look like patchwork quilts, deep red beside pale yellow, devastation adjacent to relative survival, with no obvious barrier between them. No one knows why. The leading hypothesis involves the pre-existing health of each community. The same famine-scarred vulnerability De Wita documented in London. Communities with higher rates of prior physiological stress died in greater numbers. But the mechanism by which one cluster of 100 people carried more famine damage than their neighbors a mile down the road remains unclear. Genetics may have played a role, population density, the timing of an infected traveler's arrival, or simple, terrible chance. The stochastic mathematics of early transmission events that could amplify into catastrophe in one place and fizzle in another. And now, the question of how. You have the image in your head already. Rats. Black rats swarming through medieval streets, carrying fleas, spreading death. It is one of the most durable images in popular history. And it is, at best, incomplete. In 2018, a study led by Catherine Dean at the University of Oslo tested 3 models of plague transmission against mortality records from 9 European cities with reliable death data. They modeled the classic rat-flea cycle. They modeled airborne pneumonic transmission. And they modeled a third possibility: human ectoparasites, body lice, human fleas, the tiny organisms living in the seams of linen undergarments, feeding on blood, defecating plague bacteria into bite wounds. In 7 of 9 cities, the human ectoparasite model fit the observed mortality curves significantly better than the rat model. The rats made for a better story. But the lice living in your shirt were likely the real killers. This does not mean rats were irrelevant. Barbara Bramanti and colleagues published a careful response in 2019, arguing that in warmer Mediterranean port cities with large established rat populations, the classic rat-flea model may still hold. The plague probably arrived in European ports via ship rats, Genoese trading galleys, lateen-rigged and low in the water, carrying cargo and carrying death. But once the bacterium reached human populations, it spread at the speed of human contact, not rodent migration. The black rat, Rattus rattus, is a sedentary creature. It does not march across countries. The plague did. It covered 1.5 to 6 kilometers per day across varied terrain. It leaped the North Sea by ship and appeared in Norway within weeks of its arrival in English ports. No rat colony made that journey. The vector was us, our clothes, our closeness, the inescapable intimacy of medieval life. Families sharing beds, workers sharing quarters, the unavoidable density of bodies in a world without private space as we understand it. Consider what this means for the death toll. The number you learned, 1/3 of Europe, has a long pedigree. It derives from chronicler estimates, from the rough calculations of early modern scholars, from a figure repeated so often it calcified into fact. It is almost certainly too low. Old Benedicto's comprehensive demographic analysis, drawing on English poll tax records, Florentine catasto data, Scandinavian farm abandonment records, and Iberian parish registers, argues that the first wave of plague killed approximately 50 to 60% of Europe's population. Not 1 in 3, 1 in 2. Slavin's granular manorial data from England consistently yields figures in the 45 to 55% range, with some regions exceeding 60. The 1/3 figure may describe the least affected areas. It does not describe the continent. The precise number remains genuinely debated, and intellectual honesty requires saying so. Some historians argue Benedicto's methodology overestimates by generalizing from the most devastated local records. The honest range is probably 40 to 60%, varying by region. But the old 1/3 figure is too low by tens of millions of people. The scale of what happened is larger than what most of us were taught, and the science of the last 15 years has made that clear. 1/3 of Europe is the number everyone learned. It is not the number the dead left behind. If you are watching this and thinking about another pandemic, a recent one whose arguments about transmission and mortality and vulnerability and uneven impact are still fresh, you are not wrong to make that connection. The parallels are imperfect, but they are real. A pathogen that killed selectively among the already vulnerable. A speed of transmission that outpaced official understanding. Death tolls that were debated in real time and revised upward afterward. Communities side by side with wildly different outcomes. The medieval world did not have virology, but it had observation, and some of what it observed sounds unsettlingly familiar. What do you think drove the differential survival between neighboring villages? Drop your thoughts in the comments. There may be someone in this audience who knows something the researchers haven't considered. At Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, a wealthy Augustinian priory surrounded by fields and quiet, archaeologists found a mass grave. 48 bodies in a single pit. Ancient DNA confirmed Yersinia pestis in multiple skeletons. This was not a crowded port city. This was not a London slum. This was a prosperous religious house in rural England, the kind of place you might have fled to if you believed distance and prayer could save you. Isotopic analysis of the bones showed that some of the dead were not local. They had come from elsewhere, seeking refuge. They brought the plague with them or found it waiting. Even a wealthy priory surrounded by fields and faith could not outrun what was coming. The medieval response to plague was not the helpless ignorance popular imagination suggests. Italian city-states implemented quarantine measures during the very first outbreak. Venice would formalize the practice of holding ships in harbor for 40 days. Quarantina, giving us the word we still use. Samuel Cohn's research documents street cleaning ordinances, restrictions on the movement of goods and people, public health boards assembled by municipal governments that understood, even without germ theory, that proximity to the sick was dangerous. These were not stupid people. They were people facing something no amount of intelligence could have prepared them for, and they responded with the tools they had. But the tools were not enough. In Florence, Boccaccio described the sick abandoned by their own families, mass burials in overcrowded graveyards, the social fabric tearing under a weight it was never designed to bear. In Siena, Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler, a father, wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands. He was not alone in this, he noted. There was no one to weep for the dead, because everyone expected death themselves. He believed the end of the world had come. It had not. But the world that emerged was not the one that had existed before. Here is the strangest finding of all, and perhaps the most difficult to sit with. Sharon DeWitt's analysis of skeletal remains from the generations after the Black Death shows that survivors and their descendants were measurably healthier than the pre-plague population. Average longevity increased. Skeletal stress markers decreased. People were better nourished, more robust, longer lived. Partly, this was grim natural selection. The most physiologically vulnerable had been removed from the population. Partly, it was economic. Fewer people competing for the same land and food supply meant better nutrition for those who remained. The Anonymal Chronicle recorded that surviving laborers could demand wages previously unimaginable. The catastrophe that killed half of Europe created, for those who lived through it, a world with more to go around. The cruelest irony the record holds. The generation born after the worst disaster in European history was healthier than their grandparents had been. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian whose own parents died of plague in Tunis in 1349, wrote that civilization in both the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. He understood, from North Africa, looking at the same catastrophe from the other side of the Mediterranean, that this was not a European event. It was a human event. The Mamluk Sultanate, the Golden Horde, the cities of the Middle East and Central Asia suffered too, though their records are thinner and their dead less counted by the scholarship that followed. And it did not end. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 was only the first wave. The plague returned roughly every decade for 3 centuries, preventing population recovery in some regions until the 1500s. Ancient DNA studies have traced how Yersinia pestis diversified within Europe, producing local variants that drove successive epidemics. The bacterium did not visit and leave. It moved in. What the last 15 years of science have given us is not a correction of details. It is a different story. The old version was simple. Rats, fleas, 1/3 dead, misery. The new version is harder and more human. A continent already weakened by decades of famine and climate crisis. A pathogen that traveled on human bodies, in human clothes, at human speed. A death toll far larger than the textbook said. A pattern of survival that was brutally uneven and remains partly unexplained. And afterward, a population of survivors whose bodies bore the evidence of what they had endured and whose children, by the cold arithmetic of selection and scarcity, were stronger for it. The teeth remember what the chronicles forgot. The famine of 1315 etched into the enamel of people who would die of plague 30 years later. The stress of childhood hunger, carried silently in bone and tooth until a scientist in the 21st century held a medieval jawbone under a light and read the record the body had kept. Those teeth are in laboratories now, in London and Tübingen and South Carolina. The tombstones are still beside Lake Isyk-Kul. The plague pits at East Smithfield lie beneath a London park where people walk their dogs on ordinary mornings. The deserted villages of England are gentle depressions in green fields, visible from the air as crop marks in dry summers. The outline of a community that was alive in 1347 and empty by 1350. If this changed how you understand the Black Death, subscribe and stay. The next time we go into the medieval record, we will find more of what the old stories left out. Not because anyone was hiding it, but because the dead had to wait for the science that could finally hear them. Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands in Siena in the summer of 1348. He wrote it down. The document survived. His children's names did not. But he held them, and he put them in the ground. And then he kept writing. Because someone had to. Because the record was all that would be left. It was enough. 7 centuries later, a stranger is listening.